Welcome to today's webinar on running a business during inflationary times. There's a Chinese proverb that says, may you live in interesting times. And well, the fact is that we certainly do. I think it's meant to be more of a curse than a blessing, especially for business owners, because interesting times means that there are challenges, volatility, and peril at every turn. If the times were uninteresting or boring, things are predictable and fairly easy to manage. Past 2 years have been almost a little too interesting as we've faced constant difficulties, tried to keep our businesses operating, and have been so lucky to have benefited from a boom in demand for our products and services. I'm sure many of you on the call today have had the best 2 years in your history, in your company's history, and it feels like that is going to continue for at least this year in 2022. But as we begin to make our way forward through this pandemic, and out of this pandemic, hopefully, we're facing new challenges that many of us have never seen in our careers. Inflationary cost increases are coming at us every day. Although we originally thought this would be short-lived, it looks like it's sort of the new normal, at least for the short term. So at Landscape Ontario, at our task force meetings, we thought this would be a perfect time to present this topic to you, and we've assembled a great panel for today's discussion. Today we have Warren Coughlin, Harold Deenen, and Bill Stensson with us. And here's a little bit of each of them, just in case you're not aware of who they are. Warren's been coaching entrepreneurs to success and freedom since 2002. He's a self-proclaimed recovering lawyer, serial entrepreneur, former college professor, as well as an actor and theater director. Warren says that an array of experiences gives him a pretty wide perspective on leadership, success, effectiveness, and fulfillment. Second up, we've got Harold Deenen. Harold is just as comfortable below the water surface as he is above it. As a sailor, a private pilot, and scuba instructor, Harold lives his belief that balance of life is an essential ingredient to happiness and success. He's passionate about horticulture and the impact that green has on our future. He's a tireless volunteer devoted to inspiring and instilling a healthy respect for the environment. And finally up, we've got Bill Stensson. He's the executive chairman of Sheridan Nurseries. Sheridan is over 100 years old and has had to weather many storms through its history. Bill has a lifetime of business experience and is instrumental in Sheridan's longevity and stature. Bill has served on many committees and boards, giving back to the industry, and also served as past president of CNLA. Sheridan Nurseries is one of the largest growers and retailers in the country and have won many awards, including the International Grower of the Year award twice. So enough for me. Give you over to the professionals. I'm going to pass this the floor along. We're going to begin with opening comments from Warren and then Harold and Bill. We're going to have about 30 minutes, 35 minutes of presentations and banter between the group. And you're welcome to then move into Q&A, and please put your any questions you may have into the chat. And my friend Alan White, our task force chair, will help me manage that part of it. So without further ado, let's go to Warren.
Hey everybody, thanks very much. And before I start, I've dealt with a lot of organizations and associations. At the risk of being sycophantic, I'm gonna do a shout out to Landscape Ontario. When COVID first hit, they were very proactive in bringing together people to help their members understand how to navigate through COVID. Now with inflation, they're one of the most proactive organizations I've seen for bringing professional support to their members as they're trying to run their businesses. And I really appreciate that. And I hope the members of the association really appreciate that as well. So in terms of how to manage in inflationary times, first, let's just get some of the facts out. So in January, we passed 5% for the first time since 1991. It was 5.1% on a year-over-year basis. Some mythology, is it all because labor costs are up? Nope. Wage data shows about a 2.4% increase, so it isn't all wage-based. Excluding gasoline, it was about 4.3%, so that's had a big part of the inflation. Shelter prices have risen at about 6.2%, groceries at about 6.5%, so that's adding a lot to it. In your industry, ready-to-mix concrete was about 4.8%. And in lumber, one of the interesting things that happened in that industry was when COVID first hit, the timber mills all thought there was going to be a collapse in demand, so they didn't replenish their inventory, and that's what drove the lumber prices. Now, it's been a couple of years since then. If COVID follows its past trajectory, it's going to probably drop in the spring and summer, and you can bet the timber organizations are trying to get it right now. So that that match between timber and lumber supply, or rather lumber demand and timber supply, should probably balance out relatively soon. Now, while all this inflationary stuff is something that hasn't happened in a while, I'm an old fart. So I remember back when I was knee high to a 26er, things were this kind of inflationary rate is not sky is falling stuff. In 1981, when I graduated from high school, inflation was 12.5%. My parents bought our first house at an interest rate of 21% for the mortgage. And yet somehow all the businesses in our community were thriving and doing fine. So I don't want to pretend that it's not serious. There are things you have to do to manage it, but it isn't also the sky is falling. We are going to come through this all right. And some of the inflation, what's unique this time around, like usually inflation follows from some sort of bubbles and things like that. This is a whole host of things that are driven it, from COVID, pent-up demand, emotional buying, supply chain management. But also there's a really, if you've paid attention to a bunch of the earning calls for public companies, they're not only maintaining margins, but they're increasing them. And this is particularly in the case where it's kind of an oligopolistic industry, where there isn't like massive competition, but concentration of ownership. So when that's happened, people are, it's not just supply chain or demand issues, but there's a lot of extra profit taking because of lack of competition. One of the implications of that is, as an industry, and whether you do buyer groups or things like that, you might want to challenge your suppliers a little bit, especially if you're in a buying group, and at least get transparency in their price increases to ensure that it's cost pass through and not extra profit taking, because there is a fair amount of that going on. Now, in terms of managing during inflationary times, what's it about? What are you trying to achieve? Well, there's really two things, right? You're trying to protect your profits and you're trying to protect demand. And what I mean by that is you don't want to protect your profits at such a level on an individual basis that you're driving demand down, and because it's overall profitability that you're still trying to maintain. So in trying to do that, there's really three main areas of consideration to think about. One is cost management. The second is operating efficiencies. And the third is your pricing strategy. So I just want to give a few comments on each of those. So on cost management, the first thing, as obvious as it may sound, monitor your costs really closely. A lot of people don't actually track their costs well enough. So you want to get a bit of a line of sight on which products are going up, which ones aren't, by how much. And then with that, sometimes in either recessionary times or inflationary times, people do this, I've got to cut back, and they just do this broad-based cutting. Don't cut across the board, cut strategically, right? Just choose things, don't cut on things that drive profitability, cut on things that are not necessary, or where there may be some inefficiencies, or where there's lower demand. And you want to balance between low cost and security of supply. And that's the other thing in this period. It isn't just like, you've got to balance, and this has become really, I've talked about this a lot during COVID, is you've got to balance your cost and your risk exposure. So before COVID hit, everybody was like, let's all just get things produced in China because it's lowest cost. COVID hit, and all of a sudden your supply is no longer available. So you've got to manage between supply reliability and cost management. So that might mean diversification a little bit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that might mean for cash flow as well. So you also then want to think about dissecting rate versus consumption. And what I mean by that is there's things you're going to use a lot of, and that may be subject to volatile price increases. In those cases, try to max out any low price contracts you have right now. And that's subject to your working capital and your storage space availability. But if you know something is going to be going up, order it a bunch of it now if you have cash. I've got a client in another industry in sort of confectionaries, and it's like, yeah, order all the stuff now, both for security of supply and also so that you can hold your cost down before inflation hits. Now, as I say, that's subject to your cash flow, and it's subject to your storage space. That's on stuff you're going to use a lot. There's other things that are discretionary with less volatility, where if you buy too much of it, there's going to be wastage. So in those cases, maybe you want to order less of that. If you can create or participate in buyer groups, with more clout, you can challenge some of the price increases. Be really rigorous in your inventory management. You can tie up a lot of money in inventory. So that's the balance. You want to order a lot now on stuff that you know you're going to use, but not so much that you're going to have excess tied up in inventory. So a lot of this, the subtext of all of this, is you've got to get good at financial management. You've got to be looking at your financial statements a lot, and looking at the different cost items on there. If you think you're going to need financing, consider securing it now. Right now, again, there's everything I'm talking about, there's a risk, right? Because we're in what's called Knightian uncertainty, that it's hard to attach probabilities to what's actually going on. There's kind of uncertainty about what risks may materialize and which don't. And so in this case, it's like, okay, financing, maybe you need it, maybe you don't. So you're either going to get like a line of credit where you'll tap the money when you don't need it, but lines of credit will vary the rates as interest rates change, or you can borrow money up front now and you'll start paying interest on it now, but you're going to lock in an interest rate. Usually, if you're hearing the noise out of the Fed and out of Bank of Canada, everyone's expecting rates to go up. So one of your costs, if you're going to need debt, is lock in your rates when you can at a lower amount. And then part of cash cost management is also cash flow management. Make sure you have cash flow projections. Don't just look at your historic cash flow. You should be looking out at least 3 months. You know, when COVID hit, I had a client in the event space who got just smoked because there was a total collapse in demand. But she survived really, really well. And she's in fact had her best year since, because she did great cash flow management and was prepared for the, onslaught. All right, so that's sort of about cost management. Then you've got operational efficiencies. Years ago, I met this guy who was a very famous inventor. He invented all kinds of crazy things like microwavable cookware and shaped tampons and diapers that fit babies and all this kind of stuff. So he had this crazy reputation. And he called up the people who make sun chips. And he said, pay me $50,000. And they said, what for? He goes, I don't know, I'm going to walk around. And so they took a flyer on him because he had a good reputation. And he came back, he goes, you guys don't make chips. You guys don't sell chips, you sell bags. Chips are just a reason to sell the bags. And it was basically his analysis of the cost structure. Problem is, you got an inch bag that doesn't do anything. So he invented this little plastic welding exercise, cut off 3/4 of an inch on either end, saved them about $1 million a year. So it's operating efficiencies are really important for making your cost management. So even if you can't control what the cost of the lumber is or the cost of the granite is, if you're efficient, you're going to have less wastage. I had a, in your industry, that's the simplest of rules, right? Measure twice, cut once. Use that philosophy as much as possible and train your people rigorously. I had a construction company client that they went from 1.5 million to 5 million in 1 year, but their profits went from $250,000 to minus $300,000. And when they thought people were stealing from them. When I dissected their financial statements, it was wastage and lack of repair and maintenance of equipment and inefficient use of resources because they just weren't used to dealing with jobs that big. When you can manage your efficiencies, what does that mean? That means process improvement. Like look at your sequencing of events, look at your labor training along with how you performance manage. Now, the other pressure you're facing in your industry right now is a tight labor market. Performance management in a tight labor market can be challenging because people, if they don't like how you're managing, they can get up and walk and get another job. So what that means is actually building a high performance culture. Anyone who's ever performed sports, played sports, who likes being on the line with the slacker, right? Nobody wants to be on a hockey team with the one defender who just drags his butt. So you want to create an organization that it's the same, right? Like no one wants to be on the team where there's somebody who's slacking. So when you build a high performance culture, you are naturally going to produce greater efficiencies, especially if people are well trained. In your industry, one of the things I've observed is spring hits in a hurry, and all of a sudden you're hiring people and you're putting them on site, and not everybody is well trained. And so that leads to wastage, that leads to inefficiencies and redos with clients and things like that. If you can spend the time training people to do it right, you're going to experience less of that. Another piece of operational efficiencies are looking at your logistics, travel time, having the right supplies and tools so they aren't there and having to go back to the shop to pick things up over and over again. So that means the simplest answer to that is like in-truck checklists, right? Make sure everybody before they leave the yard or before they leave their home, wherever they're going to, they have to do a checklist And there's things you can do on just iPads now or on phones, and people submit to you the checklist to make sure they've done it. All these little things will start to improve your efficiencies. Finally, on pricing, this isn't just about, the one job, it's about your reputation as well. So communicate, communicate, communicate. If you've ever been in an airport when a plane is delayed and nobody tells you what's going on, it makes you freaking crazy, right? But if they say, hey, there was a part that wasn't available, the plane is a half an hour late or an hour late, you've got time to go and get a sandwich or something, you're like, oh, thank you, right? So it's the same thing with the price increases. Letting people know what's going on with supply and demand and inflationary pressures will at least help them understand. Second thing, when you're doing your pricing, and this, I'm going to say a few things that might be controversial. Think about where quality is necessary and where it isn't. There might be certain materials that you might like to use the highest quality material, but is it really necessary for that client? Now, the simplest answer to that is I don't want to make clients upset by giving them poor quality, is if you're communicating, is give them the choice. In my view, because no one is actually seeing this, it's at the back end of the property, you don't actually need the highest quality material for that. And you give them the choice. And that way they have some control over that pricing as well. Next thing in your pricing, and this may be, it's not controversial, but it's something to think about. And it's profit preservation versus margin preservation. Now, what do I mean by that? $100 profit is a 60% margin on a $50 cost. $100 profit is a 57% margin on a $75 cost. What that means is, if all you're doing is keeping the $100 profit, so you're doing a pure cost pass through to your client, your profit stays the same, but your margins will drop. So are you trying to preserve your profit in dollars, or are you trying to preserve your margins? If you are preserving your margins, you are doing more than doing a cost pass through to your customer. And you got to just think about for yourself which way you want to go on that. If you are doing a margin preservation, just know that you are in fact doing more than just passing on inflationary pressures to your client. And one of the things to be thoughtful about that, your industry has really benefited, right, from people staying at home and wanting to fix up their yards for the last 2 years. Everybody I know in the travel industry is starting to see that pent-up demand getting released. If you're now people are making really emotional decisions too. So the rational actor thing is not necessarily what's happening, but people at some point are going to have to make a choice between the yard cost or the landscaping, and am I going to go on that family trip that I've been wanting to do for a long time? So if you're jacking up your prices too much, you might be getting them in a place where they're having to make that decision. So as you're starting to increase your prices, if you're trying to do some margin preservation, test it a little bit first to see what the response of the market is. Okay. And then when you are, you're locking in contracts now for jobs that are happening in September. If you aren't able to do that inventory, buy everything now, it is probable that you're going to face some cost increases. So you're going to have to negotiate with your clients and allow for the cost increases, particularly if it's just cost pass through 8 months from now, if there are any cost increases. If the client isn't willing to do that, you might need to build in some margin into your pricing to accommodate those anticipated price increases. All right. And then finally, just think at a marketing level about any low cost or high touch activities to entrench your clients or keep them coming back. Things that maybe don't cost you a lot, but they make the client feel like, wow, this is a great organization. They just went that extra mile. So whether it's, a toy for their kid in the backyard, if you've laid down a putting green, give them a set of golf balls, give them wine glasses for their opening barbecue of the year, buy them some burgers or steaks for their first barbecue, whatever it is that, doesn't necessarily cost you a lot of money, but makes them think, wow, this is a really sort of high touch organization. And I'm happy to pay a little bit of extra for an organization that's going to support me in that kind of way. All right. So I think I'm within the time limit. That was basically my summary of things to think about within cost management, operating efficiencies, and pricing strategy.
Yeah, thanks so much, Warren. Real amazing stuff. Really practical tips there. The business has been in in business for 60 years. Harold, what are your thoughts on what we're going to be going through and what you've been through?
Well, I don't know what's left to say, Warren. I mean, I'm I'm looking at my notes, and what I'm seeing is everything you said.
Sorry about that.
You know, like the first thing I have on my list is protect your margins, and I'm sitting there going, "Has he got a copy of my notes, or what's going on there?" In any case, a couple of things, and I think I touched on this before, is that you know, in all the years I've been doing this, inflationary years weren't as tough for me as recessionary years. The inflationary years were a challenge, and Warren, you touched on a number of ways that that we used to get through them. But a lot of them tend to touch on each other. A lot of the procedures, a lot of the techniques that you use to get through an inflationary year, you use to get through a recessionary year as well. We know that in this coming year, and as a matter of fact, last year, that materials and labor costs will rise. Make no mistake, labor costs are falling behind. We're seeing what a lot of people are calling the great resignment. I think this is the term they're using. People are actually waking up from COVID and wondering if the career that they have is right. I think that we're going to see a mass exodus in an awful lot of industries, and I think that we're going to need to do more and more to hang on to the labor that we have. And as we all know, it's certainly in the landscape industry more than anything else, that's what we sell. We sell our labor, and it's our most valuable asset. So, my number one recommendation to you would be protect the labor that you have, make sure they're taken care of, and if you need to pay them more than the competition, because the competition I've found is always willing to cherry pick, then you may have to pay them a bit more. It's going to rise, and you better get used to it. As I think, as Warren pointed out, we're seeing labor rates go up about 1.7 to 2%, and we all know that that's falling behind as well. Warren, you touched on the fact that we should renegotiate loans, or at least negotiate loans that we might need down the road. It's a good opportunity to lock some stuff in. Maybe something that you may not have touched on is I think a lot of contractors out there still rent space, and that's the time that you want to approach your landlord and make sure that you're locked in for a longer period of time and for a reasonable rate. At least you know what's coming. Cutting expenses, well, yeah. Again, don't just cut expenses across the board. It's the stupidest thing you can do. Cut the expenses strategically. Make sure that you know which ones you really don't need. You talked about keeping inventory. Our company mostly does things on a just-in-time basis. In other words, as we're doing a job, an installation job, the material will show up the day that we need it or the day before, so that we don't have inventory costs. It tends to put more change in our pocket. But during inflationary times, it is wise, if you're doing a lot of carpentry, then buy that lumber that you know you'll inevitably need. If you're doing lockstone and you know which kind and what color, then go ahead and buy it and keep it in stock if you've got the room for the inventory. Again, beware. What are we going to see? We're going to see consumer demand going down a little bit, because people have been used to really, really low interest rates. And now all of a sudden they're seeing an increase in interest rates. And housing seems to be the number one expense that most consumers are seeing right now. So, even a quarter point or half point increase is going to affect their disposable income. Do the best that you can. And the one thing that we found out after our first recession was that the rules or the lessons that we learned really paid off in future years. One of the things that you need to do is you need to lengthen your payment terms, and have a discussion with your suppliers. You should be trying to pay at 60 days if you can, rather than the 30 that's traditional, and improve your collection, improve your bill collection. Cash flow is where it's at, and it's like I always say, particularly during recession as opposed to inflationary times, cash is king. Because the more cash you have, the more bargaining power that you have. I know that within our own company, we learned to collect money really, really fast. We put some credit terms in place, and our turn days are at about 37 days now, which is not bad considering some of the people that we deal with. And that wasn't a shot if any of my customers are on this. I'm gonna, Jeff, have I got a few minutes just to touch on some of the stuff that I want to talk about?
Yeah, you got another three minutes or so if you want to keep going.
Great. What I want to talk about a little bit more is, and I said this before, inflationary. Bill and I, well, a lot of you folks have seen a lot more than 5%, and it could go up a little bit more, but I don't think we're going to see that much more, not before the Fed starts hammering us. But more importantly, now is a time to start looking to preparing yourself for a recession. And the recession is probably not within the next 2 or 3 years, according to the economists, but they don't know what they're talking about anyway. Sorry if any of you are with us today. But recession is something that should scare you. Recession is something that kills companies. It kills companies that don't have the stability, to weather a storm, even though an average recession only goes from 9 months to a year. But it's the new companies that don't know their costs, and they get beat up, and they don't realize what happened. So initially, what will happen is the recession will hit, and people will be out of jobs. And those people that are out of jobs all of a sudden decide that, hey, landscaping's where it's at. We can make some money there, and it's great. In many cases, some of them try to extend the underground economy. So what happens? Well, what happens is that those legitimate contractors that are working hard and taking care of the residential market now have to watch out, because they seem to be competing with these new guys with the wheelbarrow and the pickup truck, and they need to go and find some work. So they start to move in to a little more complicated area of commercial, industrial, institutional. And then people like myself start getting nervous, because now I've got to compete with people who came from the residential sector, if that makes sense to you. So, those are the kinds of things that inevitably happen. I've been through three recessions, one not so bad, a couple of them not so good. And that's what the problem is. The problem is having to realize what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot more available labor, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good labor. And as I said before, they last about a year, a little less than a year. So you've got to be able to weather them. And there's an awful lot of the same strategies. I don't know if I've touched over them too quickly, but I'll turn it over to Mr. Stensson.
Thanks, Harold. That's amazing info. And the two professions where you can just be wrong and it doesn't really matter are meteorologists and economists. So it's that they're famous for that. So I think it's great. We're gonna go to Bill. I don't know, Scott, do you want to bring up the couple of slides that Bill can?
Okay. Well, Scott's doing that. Invite Harold to jump back in at any time. with any stories that might trigger. But one of the things I'm going to say right off the bat are that these are the good old days. We believe it or not, and we sort of started telling ourselves that during the 1980s, when the interest rates were really high. And he said, you know, this is something that's happened. We survived it. And we're going to look back on this as the good old days because something else is going to happen. And sure enough, you know, other things do happen, like the early 90s when the recession took hold. When I'm looking at the inflation chart here, this take a look at quickly at it. I'm not going to go through it, but it's really one giant wave, you know, from the mid 70s through to about the mid 80s, and then it's dropped off quickly, and we've had nothing in terms of historical inflation for like 20 some years. And I remember my father saying that in the 50s and 60s, you know, a standard mortgage rates, 5%, 6%, with long 25-year amortization terms was standard. And now we've had those same rates now, or even less, shorter terms now. It's harder to get longer terms these days. So really, to me, it was just one giant tidal wave of inflation that we had for about 15 years, 10, 15 years. And as Harold said, it wasn't the inflation that was the problem. It was the recessions, and there's been more recessions than inflationary periods, I believe. My research here shows we've had 5 since the 1970, mid-70s, 74, 75. Then 2 of them in 80, 81, which was a real bad one. And back to Warren's point, I too had a mortgage at 17.5% for 5 years because I was afraid of it going to 21 or 2, which it did. And the only thing that mattered was that the cash payment I had to make, I could manage. So the percentage of the mortgage was irrelevant. It was the cash that counted. So when I think about these things as a company, going in the late 70s, I just joined us, so I had, you know, zero input as far as management went. But just seeing what happened and how it was dealt with, I don't think we did things very well. You know, we were over our heads in a lot of it. Nobody had gone through a recessionary period like this. We didn't know how to deal with it. And so we made a lot of mistakes. We must have done some things right because we survived. But I remember in some pricing sessions and the wage increase sessions, they're tossing around 5%, 10%, 15% even, like it was 5% was the rounding error. And nowadays, you know, you're much more precise. We have much better technology, and you're looking at every item, every person, and you're probably dealing with a 1/10%. So sometimes I look back and say, you know, we survived, and not through a lot of great decisions or management, but we did survive it. So I'll say that the most important thing, and we learn that the hard way in some cases, but it's your employees, regardless of what you're making. And we're a grower and a retailer, not a landscaper or maintenance. And the employees are number one, and they got to be well-trained employees. Just can't be employees. You've got to invest in them, and you have to invest in your employees basically as much as or more than any other part of your business, whether it's technology or, you know, the quality of your product. Those are givens. But I'd say in recessionary times or inflationary times, make sure you protect and are looking after your best employees. They're going to be the ones that get you through the hard times. They're going to be the ones that understand what you're going through. And if sacrifices do have to be made, they're the ones that understand why they have to be made and are usually more willing to take part in it if that's what happens. So you got to get with employees right off the bat. Now the converse of that is we've had some good times. And as you pointed out, the last 2 years have been the best 2 years probably in our industry collectively. And will this year be just as good? All signs point to that. But our biggest concern is after good years, their biggest danger is complacency. So I'd be more concerned about complacency amongst staff and employees after good years than dealing with the tough times of inflation and recession. People understand that because they feel it in their own pocketbooks, and they live with it at the gas pump and wherever else, whatever else they may be doing. But good times and complacency sometimes go hand in hand, and that can be a tough one to combat, because when you've had very good results, it's hard to say, well, you know, we're not good. Of course, we've done well and we are good, but don't take it for granted. If you take it for granted, that's your first step down the slippery slope. So to me, that's a bigger danger than inflation and recession. The other thing is take advantage of the association, Landscape Ontario specifically. I'm thinking back in the 70s and 80s, LO did not have the wherewithal to hold sessions like this technologically, but also just the overall information and the staffing power, the knowledge to be able to help with the number of members. Back then, I think in the early 70s, help me here, Harold, LO probably had 500, 600 members. And now I heard that we're over 3,000 or 4,000.
Yes. Well,
And
Joe Salemi would know better than I, but certainly the strength
Yeah.
of Landscape Ontario is the networking ability. Absolutely, Bill, no question.
Yeah, and 1,000 added within the last 5 years. So I'm assuming that a lot of the people that are members now did not go through the 1980 recession, because that would mean that they've been around for over 40 years, which would put them in their 60s. So they probably aren't, haven't just decided to get into landscaping and garden center and nursery business. So a lot of this high inflation will be new. And as Harold mentioned, 5%, bring it on. You know, that's easy stuff as far as inflation goes, because we've seen it far worse. But I think there are other pitfalls that we have to worry about. Competition from everything. For example, as you pointed out, I think Warren said, you know, the travel industry is gearing up, and as soon as the mandates are eased up enough, and we're seeing it already, that people will be flocking to travel and doing all kinds of things. Will they abandon our industry? I don't believe so. If they spent $5,000-$10,000 doing a backyard oasis or more, they're not going to abandon it. They still have to maintain it. You know, you don't build something and then just leave it behind. You keep it. Marketplace. So I think that there's still a huge opportunity for this industry. And so to me, opportunity is the big thing we should be looking for, regardless of inflation, regardless of recession. Look at the opportunity that we present. We've got the green industry, people's homes. That's their oasis. Exercise, it all adds up to a good, positive, you know, mental health situation, which is the top of the words today, top of everybody's mind. And so we have huge opportunities here. So I look at this as an opportunity to do things differently, make some changes, and we'll come out of it stronger. I know that we did. We come out of every recession and inflationary period stronger. Sometimes it's a little painful, but it happened. And I think another thing that Harold, you had said is that cash is king. And I recall that we lost opportunities because of cash. And I think that if you can be an opportunity where you have cash, preserve cash, then you'll be better off for it.
And yeah, if I can just add on top of that, Bill, as you point out, the last 2 years have been good for the industry. This is an opportunity to stockpile a little bit of that cash, you know, increase your retained earnings, put it away in a holding company if you need to, but certainly stockpile the cash, because recession, I don't know. it's difficult to predict. Seems to be cyclical, but we got one coming sooner or later.
There's always one around. It's just like a wave. You have a recession, then you have a good market, then you have a recession. It's just a crest and trough. It's inevitable. It's a matter of when.
If I can diverge and go off on the tangerine here for just a second.
Go for it. Maybe we'll we'll maximize our screens again.
Yeah.
Scott, thank you for that.
So Peter's comment, if everyone's got the chat up, Peter, that's a very interesting comment, and I completely agree with you that a lot of this, the downturn, which was causing inflation. I think what we're seeing, an awful lot of this inflation is caused by, and Warren, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but certainly supply chain issues, so supply and demand, and a lot of this short-term inflation is coming as a result of that, and obviously some profit taking going on as well. But yeah, I saw that comment and I didn't want people just to skip on by it, Peter.
That's great. And I think that one thing I'd like to question everybody about is we talked a lot about employees and about wages and trying to keep up with, people's cost of living is increasing. Inflation's really hitting everybody's cost of living, especially those on the lower end of the wage scale to a greater extent than us. And many of those are our employees. So what is everybody thinking about in terms of wage growth over the next 12 months in terms of just trying to keep up with our team's cost of living?
I think you have to budget for it. And now there's COLA, like cost of living increases, and then sort of market competition. So I'd almost break it down into two things. Like I think wages have been held low for a long time, and now there's a shift in the power, right? Like from a market standpoint, labor has more power that way. So that's going to result in some escalating prices because people can shop around and they're less loyal. At the same time, there are other things that you can do to make yourself an attractive employer other than wages, and that's why I talked about culture. And I think too many people pay too little attention to that. People want to feel valued. They want to be part of an organization that they care about. So living wage is sort of price of entry stuff. Like I got to be able to feed my family and be able to put some money away. After that, though, it's like, what's my life like? If I'm working for people who care about me, who challenge me, who make me feel valued, I'd rather work for that person than somebody who's going to be a jerk to me. I mean, in its most basic terms. And so if you can be an attractive employer brand, that can mitigate some of the upward price pressures, because someone will take, and there's lots of studies on this, people will take less money to be part of an organization that they feel is ethical, that treats people well, that they have some meaningful contribution to, than a place that doesn't care about them.
Absolutely correct, Warren. I think if you look at the studies, you'll find that I think wages is somewhere around 6th or 7th on the list, which I found absolutely remarkable. I always thought that wages were right at the top of the list, but they're way down.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just culturally, if you look at the mass retirement that's happened or mass migration away from certain jobs into other jobs, the healthcare workers in the US, they've lost 500,000 healthcare workers in the US to retirement or just resignation away from that industry. And those are people who are passionate about, you don't go into healthcare because you're not passionate about healthcare. I mean, you love healthcare, you're just treated like crap for the past 2 years. So you're exiting from that industry. And maybe our industry, if we do the right work, Sally, we can attract a lot of those people who are leaving other industries into our world. Any thoughts, Bill?
I was thinking, surveys about wages and prices have always thrown me, because people say, well, prices, for example, are not the most important thing. Wages aren't the most important thing until guess when? You go to make a purchase or you start talking about a wage with somebody. I think there's a caveat there. Wages are not important as long as your whole wage scale is competitive and it is reasonable and you're not going on the cheap end. Prices are not important as long as you've got that value scale way up at the top and service and that sort of thing. Then of course they're not important. But with all things being equal, price will end up being the deciding factor. If you have something that's exactly the same quality, exactly the same service, what are you going to do? Pay more for one than the other? No, nobody would. Same thing with wages. So they got to be, the caveat there is that wages are down the scale because you're making now an assumption that they're in the level where it's a living wage. If it's not a living wage, it's going to go to the top. So I'd be very careful there. I think our industry has the ability to reverse a trend or a conception over the many, many years that we're a low-paying industry. And we were for numbers of years. And I think there's been a real reversal of that or a changing of that trend over the past few years, probably especially in the landscape side, because it's so labor intensive. But we see it also on the farming side and in the stores. If we pay somebody the same kind of a wage that they do working for Gap, we're not going to get anybody. We need people that deserve more and that are worth more. And you're not going to get them by paying those wages. So you have to pay more. And that's fine, because you get back what you put in. You expect more, and usually you get what you expect, right? If you expect more, you'll get more. If you don't expect much, well, you're not going to get much because anything will keep you happy. So
all retail is not created equal then.
No, all retail is not created equal.
Interesting.
Jeff.
Yes, Al.
I'm reading through the chats here, and I think this is a great conversation line you have going here. And I didn't want to lose track. There's a lot of these questions or comments and questions from
Thank you.
Renee, David, Stephen are related around this labor component. And I know in my own experience in talking to the membership, a lot of we employ a tremendous amount of young people too. Sometimes first jobs, a lot of them over the last couple of years, their stresses have been around things like owning a house. But I think I wouldn't take our eyes off. I'd like to hear the panelists' comments, in particular Warren. Our employees are probably feeling inflation at a lot higher rate than we are because fuel costs, food costs, rent costs, getting to and from work, clothing, all these things when you're on an income that was already tight. I know my workforce last year, buying a house was just it has become such an unattainable number. But now this spring when resurveying and the inflationary rates and the cost of fuel, they're all stressed when I'm talking, not about the house anymore. How am I going to put enough gas in my car to get to work? I think this is going to become more and more critical that we watch the effect on our employees as it relates to inflation. Recession probably affects our businesses more, but just different ways or ways to look at. So a lot of these comments, can we afford to pay our employees higher wages? Can we is $26 an hour enough? So these are probably more tangible and more real issues facing us over our supply chain issues and some of the other things in front of us.
And we could have a pretty big philosophical conversation about this too, about the way we run our economy and society generally. I mean, we've got so used to our ability to buy things at a cheaper level that I think we've lost the sense of value associated with that. And if you stand back outside of society and in real basic terms, if people aren't willing to pay for the cost of something, then that thing should not be made available. And the cost of doing your business, people have to eat. They have to be able to put food in the car, fuel in the car, and they have to be able to put a roof over their heads. And if they can't do that, and this isn't about you not paying for it, it's actually the end customer, right? Like the customer has to be willing to pay what it costs to deliver the service. And that cost are the people. And that's partly why I talked about communication. If you can share with customers these pressures and the fact that, yes, to buy a home for an employee, I had a client who was had a moving business, and this isn't directly the wage thing, but it is about talking to customers about how to protect your own team. That to be a mover every day is freaking hard on your body, right? And so he built into his system the breaks that they're allowed to take during the day so that they didn't get hurt. And he'd received complaints from customers about these people are standing around slacking. And it's like, I'm not going to kill my employee for you and not be available for anybody else. And it's the same thing. So there's both an ethical part of this and there's an economic part of it. And every business owner has to sort of struggle with that on their own. You know, I confess I default a little bit to the side of, you don't get to go to the oil company and say, you know what, customers don't want to pay, so I'd like to pay you 20 cents less a gallon. Like, you're not allowed to do that, right? So why should you be able to go to your employee and say, yeah, I know you have to pay for rent and food, but I only want to pay you 80% of those costs. Like, ethically, that's just because that if you succeed in doing that, candidly, that's an exercise of power, right? That's an exploitation of economic power. But then there's the economic reality on the other side. And that's why those things like efficiencies and negotiating supplies and communicating effectively with customers is important. So that's a long sort of philosophical answer. But at a pragmatic level, I think, yeah, you're going to have to pay people to be able to live, or they're just going to go get other jobs, because these people are navigating between industries a lot. And there are other people in windows and doors and construction and road crews and all that kind of stuff who are going to pay them that kind of, because they're having as much trouble as you are finding labor. In my business, I work across all industries. Everybody is having that problem.
Quite frankly, Warren, the biggest raider of our labor of late has been government. They come after our people because they've been trained, they're certified in many cases, and they know what they're doing. And you know, it's difficult to compete with government wages. That is one of the hardships that all of us have in business, and certainly we try, but it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Is there,
Well, I
is there the ability to look at when the three of you are on the panel, even Jeff chime in, is we've just come through, and we said it over and over, we come through two of the best economic years. Profitability has been up across the board. I hear it over and over and over. We want to make sure going into inflationary times that we watch, Warren, you started off with it, watch our profitability. But at the same time, I think a little bit of reevaluating our profitability and make sure enough is going to the important parts in our business to reinvest in labor might be one of those areas that you need to take a hard look at. Can we afford to do it? Well, how's it going to change us to biggest boom to make sure we secure, as the panelist said, secure your labor force going into this time?
And afford not to invest in your employees, as they learned long ago. Don't invest in them and they stick around. Invest in them and they go somewhere else. Well, you're better off investing in them and trying to keep them than to have the ones not invested in and they stick around. Comment I saw about costs outside of Toronto being just as high. You're right. I live in Collingwood. Very hard for people to get employees up here. I know it's mostly a service industry up here because of the four-season aspect. But the housing boom, everything else, people are putting off construction projects for well over a year because they can't find the employees, and the cost of rents are so high that a lot of the workers can't afford to live in the area. So it's not just a Toronto phenomenon.
We had a similar situation here as well. For those of you who don't know, I'm not actually in Canada right now. Down in Key Largo, Florida, and the majority of people who work in the industry don't live in the Keys because they can't afford to live in the Keys. So they have to come in about an hour away from Homestead, Florida every day. And it's interesting to see we're hiring signs all over the place, but I really saw an interesting billboard the last time I was up in Homestead that was offering AC air conditioning technicians free room and board. That was included with the wages. It's so desperate for them to try and get them. So yes, Bill, I know, because I live in Collingwood most of the year as well, and I know that it's difficult. It's not as bad as Toronto, but it's pretty damn bad.
But it was only 8 years ago in Calgary, you could drive by a Tim Hortons and they were offering signing bonuses for employees on their signs outside. So
Yeah.
this isn't a new problem, and people do, like at the end of the day, customers are gonna learn that the prices for the service are being recalibrated based on the cost of doing business.
Yeah, for sure. Well, gentlemen, we've got 3 minutes left. I want to end with one sort of final thought from each of you. And I wondered, we had a good discussion yesterday on our preamble about personal debt and in the business in times like this. And I think that, with 1,000 new 1,000 of our members have only been in business less than 5 years. What would your advice be to them in terms of getting things kicked off and taking risk themselves personally for their businesses? Start with Harold.
Okay. Well, I think you started with me because of a story I told you yesterday.
You don't have to tell any stories, but just some advice that you might have for these guys.
Back in 1980 and sometime around then, our company had a really rough year, and we barely made it through. And at the end of it all, the bank came to me and said they'd like to have my house, which I wasn't too happy about. But basically, at that time, we didn't know that we could actually go to another bank. Just kidding, of course. But we did. My darling wife, who's over in the kitchen over here, so can hear what I'm saying, had enough faith in me that we put a mortgage on the house and kicked it into the company to keep it afloat. Would I recommend that strategy for anybody else in business? No, don't do it unless you absolutely have it and you're backed into a corner. You should always hang on to your house if at all possible. But yeah, that was a tough go, and we learned a lot. That really gives you focus, I got to tell you.
Sure, Bill. What's your thought on for these 1,000 companies with us that are less than 5 years old?
Less than 5 years might be a bit different. For us, the real tough years were the recession that lasted not 6 months, but about 3 years in my mind, from 1990 to 92. We were in a very, very tight position financially as a company, and we lost opportunities to do things because we didn't have the cash and couldn't borrow any more money. And after that, when we came out of that, we said, never again will we not have enough cash in the war chest to take advantage of an opportunity when it came along. That was probably the biggest learning. But to get there, we had to make some very, very difficult decisions in how we ran the business in those early 90s. And cutting a lot of fat out, you might say. A few hardships, wage rollbacks, already, especially for the managers, and it had to be done. But we survived it, came out of it stronger, and now I can safely say that we have a war chest. So if an opportunity comes along, we will take advantage of it. And so get back to it. These are the good old days. Don't forget that. No matter what how far it rolls out, you look back at this as a great time to have a business. But there's also huge opportunities right now for our businesses to grow, expand, service the customers. They're all out there and they all want our business, us to do the business for them.
Thank you, Bill. And Warren, a final thought from you.
On the debt thing, I don't actually have a specific piece of advice because a lot of it is based on your own risk profile, right? And your own risk tolerance. So there's a great book called The Breakthrough Company, and they looked at, they did a study of companies that went from, startup to like making a lot of money, not in the tech space, but just more generally. And one of the common denominators was the big gamble, that a lot of people who made it big, like there was a big risk that they took. Now the roadside is littered with ones that it didn't turn out that well. So I'd almost look at it like, what is your ability to sustain a loss? Generally speaking, I think of debt as a good tool if it drives growth. Going into debt to keep yourself alive is a bad strategy. You can scale back, you can go small. There's a lot of ego that gets wrapped up in it, but you are not required to stay with the business you have in that moment, right? And a lot of people, they want to keep their people, which is a beautiful sentiment. But at times, if things are bad, you can scale down, you can get a part-time job, you can do other things and then come back to the business later if that's what you want. So unless you have that risk tolerance, like if you've got nothing to lose and it's like, hell, I'm going to borrow, $500,000 and if the bank comes after my house, so be it, I'll get another one in 2 years. If that's your attitude, go for it. But if losing those things is really going to hurt you, then don't do it. But if you can say this debt, I've done it for myself. I have had borrowed money to put into a marketing initiative that paid off. So that was a smart debt, right? Because I was using that to leverage growth. But debt because I'm just trying to postpone the inevitable, bad strategy.
Well, that's great. And I think a perfect note to end things on today. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I can't thank our panelists enough. Warren, Harold, and Bill, thank you for your candor and your insight and your motivation for all of us to get out there and keep this thing going. It is an exciting time in the industry, and it's going to be, I think, a great year in 2022. So let me sign off there. I'll thank the team at Landscape Ontario for all of their hard work and their help through this last couple of years, especially our COVID task force, my fellow members of the COVID task force, led by Alan White. Can't thank everybody enough for helping get through this time. So until next time, folks, wish you a good afternoon and all the best to everyone. Stay safe out there and let's get spring going here. Come on, it's time. All the best, everybody.
See ya.
All the best. Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.